Welcome everybody to this WISERD seminar. Thank you for making time to join us today. We've got an excellent speaker, our colleague Bernd Bonfert, who has been working on community-supported agriculture, and he's done this in a comparative dimension by looking at 3 country studies, and he's contextualized it in the context of the theoretical literature on solidarity economies and social movement studies. So Bernd, we're all looking forward to hearing from you. Bernd will speak for about 25, 30 minutes, and then that will leave us plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. So Bernd, over to you.
Right, thanks a lot, Kevin. Let me share my screen here. Okay, everyone can see that? Can I get a nod? Right, very good. Yeah, all right, so thanks a lot everyone for joining the session. Like Kevin said, I've been doing research on community-supported agriculture, specifically their networks across different scales in the UK and abroad. And I'll be talking about this today. First of all, I'll introduce the subject itself before presenting some of my findings and also discussing preliminary observations of the ongoing research, basically. First of all, the project itself is part of a work package on the foundational economy, citizenship, and new forms of common ownership. The foundational economy can be defined as the group of heterogeneous activities delivering goods and services which meet essential citizen needs and provide the infrastructure of everyday life, which obviously includes things such as housing, care, energy, transport, education, and of course food, which is my topic. And because these systems are essential for human survival, foundational scholarship tries to investigate them in terms of how they can be made more universally accessible, more sustainable, and more independent from market competition. A foundational economy is also based on active citizenship, or should be based on active citizenship, meaning people should not just be passive consumers, but empowered to actively shape and govern their economy. When we apply this to food, it means we need to ask how our food system can be made to ensure access to affordable and healthy food for everyone, how it can facilitate good working conditions and ecological production and distribution methods, all the while being able to empower citizens to have democratic control over this food system. This question obviously has become increasingly pressing now in the context of the pandemic, which has increasingly exposed critical vulnerabilities of our supply chains, not least in the food system. And in this context, we have seen across many countries rising demands for alternative provision systems that are more resilient, more ecological. And the practice of community-supported agriculture, or CSA, is especially interesting in that regard, I think, because it essentially prefigures a non-commercial, sustainable, and democratic alternative to the capitalist food system on a small scale. Unfortunately, most research only looks at this small scale, basically looking at individual CSAs, without really addressing the question of how and to what extent they can be diffused and consolidated beyond this scale and actually facilitate wider transformative change. So because of that, in my project, I investigate multi-CSA networks in the UK, in Germany, and in Italy, where I draw on theoretical concepts of the social and solidarity economy and social movement studies. And today I will focus on the national CSA network in the UK, as well as share some reflections about ongoing research on regional collaboration in Wales and in Saxony. But first, what is CSA? CSA is a form of collective agricultural production and distribution that is based on a direct partnership between the farmer and local consumers, where all agree to share the costs and products of the farm. This can include a wide range of different activities, from simple crowdfunding schemes to more explicitly anti-capitalist initiatives where ownership and decision-making are entirely collectivized. And the literature identifies various benefits of CSA, especially in regards to fostering community self-reliance, to building non-alienated labor relations, to supporting ecological agriculture. But it also cites challenges, especially in terms of CSA is still relatively marginal status in economic terms, and its limited accessibility because it tends to involve well-educated, white, middle-class backgrounds. So in that sense, there is a need to still determine to what extent CSA is just a utopian entertainment for a few middle-class consumers and their fortunate farmer friends, to quote Goodman and Dupree, or if it's bearing the seeds of a political struggle that may or may not succeed in creating a broader farmer, consumer, or broader class alliance. Now, to help find an answer, what I try to do is draw on the literature on the social and solidarity economy and social movements, especially social movement networks. The SSE, the social and solidarity economy, is essentially another theoretical framework or for an economic system that strongly intersects and overlaps with the foundational economy, but it specifically revolves around systems that democratize and socially re-embed the economy around principles of redistribution and reciprocity, democratic horizontalism, collective ownership, ecological sustainability. And in that sense, it is very much rooted in prefigurative initiatives like cooperatives, like mutual aid groups, like sharing platforms, which I would argue CSA is a part of that. And what's crucial is that the SSE is very much claimed by social movements as kind of a social movement project. It's very prominent in Southern Europe, especially. And in that sense, it combines an economic with a political dimension. This means that it does not only provide social innovations in economic terms, but actually tries to make solidarity a key principle for challenging power relations. So in that sense, it's opening spaces for contestation where people can become politicized, where there's active support for activism, for systemic transformation, basically. And that's why the SSE tends to rely on translocal networks to reach beyond the local scale. And to study these networks, I first of all look at their political-economic context conditions, which inform ways how the SSE is facilitated, what opportunities it has, what constraints it has. Then secondly, I look at the political frames and structures that SSE networks develop based on their common aims and demands, based on their collective identities, organizational structures. And then finally, I look at how they can contribute to expanding and consolidating the SSE or CSA in this case in practice, which can involve practices of scaling up through organizational professionalization or institutionalization. It can involve scaling deep through capacity building and politicization, and scaling out through horizontal diffusion and multiplication. I believe someone's not muted, so please take care of that. Now, in terms of methodology, just briefly, I approach CSA networks as qualitative case studies, which involves conducting documentary analyses of all their publications and online posts and basically coding them for the attributes that I just mentioned. It also involves conducting semi-structured interviews with leading network representatives. So far I've conducted 10 hour-long interviews and have many more lined up, I hope. And then finally, I engage in participatory observation at primarily online network assemblies and other events, as well as some very rare cases of in-person meetings. And I should note that gaining access has been quite tricky to some extent, obviously because of the pandemic, but also because people involved in CSA just in general have very limited free time. When they work on farms, they tend to work 14 hours a day, don't really check their emails very often. So in that sense, there's a lot of capacity to keep in mind there. They also are currently flooded with interview requests. So especially Italian groups have been rather unresponsive in that sense, which is one of the reasons I'm mainly presenting the other cases today. Now, all that out of the way, let's look at the case study, the CSA network in the UK, which is simply called Community Supported Agriculture. In terms of their political-economic context, we can say that CSA as a practice in the UK is relatively marginal in economic terms. There are around 220 active CSAs at the moment. Their economic volume is many times smaller, like 1,000 times smaller than the general agriculture system. And most of them don't receive any government subsidies because they're actually too small to do so. However, we can see that their output and their employment relative to land size is actually many times higher than in the general agricultural system, which I believe shows, first of all, their ability to support small ecological producers and actually improve livelihoods. And secondly, also doing so in a way that is much less demanding on natural land. CSA is also more crisis resilient, which we can see in the current situation, where we've had this 1-2 punch of COVID and Brexit, which together resulted in a major contraction of food trade, of hospitality, and also drastically increased the population suffering from food insecurity by what amounts to over 1 million more people. And in this context, we see demand for just food box schemes in general and CSA grow considerably. But because CSA is not a business model that can increase production very quickly, CSAs tended to develop long waiting lists and then eventually multiplied, basically set up new operations, often close by. And this in and of itself is difficult because of a limited access to land in the UK and a lack of ecological farming education. So these new CSAs all needed guidance and support in doing so, which they found from the national network. So consequently, we have seen the national network increase by at least 70 new members since April 2020, which is almost doubling in size, basically. About the network, its organizational structure is relatively straightforward. So members elect a board, which decides on the network's overall strategy. It also hires coordinators, which take care of day-to-day activities. So they oversee the budget, they coordinate events, they apply for funding, and they handle communications and consult with policymakers. So in that sense, grassroots members are not really that actively involved in a bottom-up sense in the network, but they engage more in mutual exchange with each other, provide mentoring for each other, and do a lot of that basically within smaller regional clusters. That's to an extent due to the limited time they have that I mentioned, but there are also just general benefits of proximity, and also many support schemes also are region specific, so there are advantages to staying in a cluster, so to speak. More about the network, it is mainly financed through grants and only to a lesser extent through membership fees, which makes its financial capacities somewhat vulnerable to fluctuation, let's say. And as you can imagine, this creates a sort of catch-22 situation where the network has a certain lack of long-term financial stability, which means it cannot hire as many employees as it would like. It has a limited range in terms of activities, which then in turn narrows down its funding opportunities and and prevents it from justifying higher membership fees. And this is a sort of circle that continues. So in that sense, the network's development is rather dependent, let's say, on outside factors. But we can see in other countries, for instance, in Germany, that CSA networks can become more self-reliant with time and with size, basically. Talking about the network politically, we can see that it expresses core values of care, ecology, diversity, fairness, solidarity, and reciprocity, which are very much reflective of the SSE at large. And it defines CSA as a hyper-local and autonomous business model for producing not just food, but also flour, fiber, or fuel, and does so based on agroecological standards, community investment, and the sharing of risks, rewards, and responsibilities. This is taken almost verbatim from the network's charter. And it's a definition that is obviously deliberately inclusive to accommodate the full range of CSA types and different ownership models that exist in the UK. And doing so without necessarily judging them based on their specific practices or ambitions. Because as one member explained to me, we took a very broad approach and said, if people identified with CSA, then that's fine. We're not going to police that term. And I think for the same reason, we can also say that the network is relatively non-confrontational, I would say, in its framing, in the sense that it only rarely addresses topics of like social inequality, corporate power, capitalism. Those are things individual members will talk about, but not really the network at large. And On one hand, this obviously enables the network to reconcile the diversity of CSA and attract new members without necessarily suffering any major internal conflicts. But on the other hand, it also means the network needs to invest additional time and labor to stay up to date on its members' activities, like it needs to conduct regular surveys, for instance, in order to determine the degree of non-commercial and ecological sustainability that they have actually achieved. In terms of long-term goals, we can say that the network wants to make CSA a viable alternative to the dominant food system. The quote here being, what we would like is a CSA in every town or place. So effectively, everyone who's interested in being a member of a CSA can find one near enough to them. So even though it's not openly confrontational, it's nonetheless very ambitious, let's say, in terms of transforming the food system at large. And in terms of its praxis, the network mainly engages in activities that diffuse CSA across the UK, that build up capacity, which combines, I would say, dynamics of scaling out and scaling deep primarily. For instance, it runs mentoring programs, it publishes written guides for new starters, it conducts its own research, it organizes information events and cultural events to raise awareness of CSA. And much of this is actually done in collaboration with external partners, so mainly other agroecological organizations, for instance, the Land Workers Alliance or the Ecological Land Cooperative, which is a land trust that helps sustainable farming in general gain access to land. And notably, there's very little to no cooperation beyond the agricultural sector, so it stays relatively sectoral and specialized in that sense. Its praxis has also quickly expanded during the pandemic, where the network started promoting more solidarity-oriented activities, so encouraging members to open themselves up and make themselves more accessible to people from low-income backgrounds. And during this time, it has also become more vocally political than it was before. Like it started hosting online talks on topics of food poverty, on cooperative economic models, on anti-racism, on the need for radical system change. And yeah, so in that sense, it shows this development, especially over the last year and a half. The same applies to its ability to scale up, because institutional advocacy has long been only an aspirational goal, but over the past year, this has changed, and the network has actually become more independent and more proactive in its advocacy work. It hired a new policy officer last year. It started formulating demands for policymakers to offer better access to land and funding, and for recognizing and supporting and providing education for ecological agriculture. But members really do emphasize that this is not so much about supporting individual CSAs, which they say are sustainable, but for making the whole model more socially accessible. The quote here being, one of the beauties of the CSA model is that it is sustainable. I think the challenge is it's still quite difficult for people on low incomes to access CSA. So that might be an area where support from government would be really helpful to allow people from lower incomes to access the benefits of CSA. And I think this further shows these underlying transformative ambitions, that this network really tries to make CSA more socially inclusive, more of a cross-class practice, so to speak, and actually change the institutional conditions of agriculture. Now, jumping scales a bit, as I mentioned before, CSA collaboration also happens at other levels, like at the regional level, for instance, which carries its own unique benefits and challenges. And my research into this is still ongoing, so I can't really talk about it in great detail, but I hope I can still share some interesting findings here. For instance, here in Wales, we have many CSAs that also work together and have actually founded multiple networks over the years. Right now, there are around 15 active CSAs. And a few years ago, in 2015, they founded their first official Welsh CSA network. They did so with the help of an organization called Social Farms and Gardens, which is another larger network, actually. And this Welsh network had its own constitution, it had its own committee, it elected chairs, and it organized regular meetings and workshops, but over the years it became relatively dormant, especially when the responsible person from Social Farms and Gardens changed projects. So this changed again in 2020, where we have seen, like I said, under the pandemic, not rapid growth, but sort of multiplication of CSAs. And especially on the Gower Peninsula, we have now seen multiple new CSAs emerge, and their creation was actually helped along quite a bit by the Kaitan CSA, which exists for multiple years now, whose founder told me, our waiting list went really big. We were just in the process of supporting one of our trainees to set up another CSA just a few miles down the road. And she had a huge interest and has now got her own waiting list. So I think this, again, shows the potential for mutual support, especially between neighboring CSAs who can share not just experiences and advice, but actually share resources and help each other along in very material terms, so to speak. And Kaitan has actually been very active in this sense, and they also collaborate with local schools and offer agroecological education. So in that sense, they diversify their activities quite a bit. And over the past year, there has actually been the foundation of a new Welsh network, CSA network, again, founded by Social Farms and Gardens because they received new funding to support horticulture, basically. And what they founded is what they call a Welsh CSA cluster group that now mainly includes people setting up new CSAs. And they meet every couple of months. They share experiences, they share advice, they link contacts to each other. This is actually a photo taken at one of their meetings. And in that sense, it works very much, not very much, but it works a bit unlike the national network in the sense that it doesn't really represent CSAs politically. It's very much just about mutual exchange among new entrants specifically. And obviously it's also carried by non-CSA organizations. A similar thing we can say about policy advocacy in Wales, where CSA is sort of represented by the Land Workers Alliance more than by its own members, so to speak. So in that sense, my preliminary observation with this research is that that there's obviously very stable collaboration between neighboring CSAs, but that as the scale gets larger, it tends to fluctuate depending on the support of external organizations, the support of individuals, as well as funding, obviously. There was actually a recent farming conference where farmers and CSAs from Wales echoed this and actually said that what they would require would be a central food hub somewhere in Wales that could actually help them store and distribute their products across Wales. And actually, the Dixon Foundation is currently offering funding to do exactly that, like to help set up such regional food hubs, especially in terms of supporting dynamic procurement. And I think these seem like worthwhile endeavors from a CSA perspective, because CSA tends to be sustainable at local level, but what it lacks is reach and what it lacks is inclusivity to an extent. So creating such an infrastructure at regional level would really help them scale out and become more accessible. And finally, I'd like to share some insights from my research abroad, especially collaboration of CSAs around the city of Leipzig in Saxony, in Germany, where CSAs have formed a local network where they share not just experiences and advice, but also actively share machinery, share vehicles and other resources, including the harvest itself in certain cases. So it's not dissimilar from what we're seeing on the Gower, but it's more advanced and more extensive in that sense. It's also the case that Leipzig used to have a single CSA whose members then eventually started their own projects. There are currently 7 of them, and they range from sizes between 70 and 200 members to one CSA that actually has 1,500 members and is still growing. And like in the UK, they're sort of members of a national CSA network and a regional cluster, but their collaboration really focuses on their immediate neighbors, with whom they've been an informal network for many years. But after receiving, again, funding from the EU, they founded an external association that now has started taking care of all their meetings, their events, that organizes festivals, that even sets up new food distribution points across the rural areas. And the CSAs have also formed a working group within Leipzig's Food Policy Council, which is interesting because they're not really involved in the policy making of it, but having this working group really allowed them to, first of all, formulate a common mission statement that they can sort of all rally around. And then secondly, it empowered them to engage in consultations with Saxony's Ministry of Agriculture, which allowed them to access further funding. And that's really something they could not have done individually. One thing that's interesting is that almost all of these CSAs are cooperatives or otherwise collectively owned, which I think on one hand reflects the influence of that first CSA, which is very explicitly anti-capitalist. Its name translates to red beet for a reason. But I think you could also argue that the German CSA movement in general is more explicitly anti-capitalist. It is literally called solidarity-based agriculture. The network is also more protective of that term. And most CSAs in Germany are actually financed through a sort of anonymous bidding system where people can actually adjust their financial contributions depending on their own financial situation. So there's a real attempt to make it more socially inclusive, to make it more class inclusive, so to speak. But what I find most interesting about this case is that ever since this large new CSA cooperative was founded, whose name is Cola, this has actually fueled a relatively new and unfamiliar competitive tension between the CSAs in this area. Competition around members, around employees, around public reception. And they're relatively unsure how to tackle this because they are unfamiliar with this challenge. And they also recognize to a certain extent that there are just structural causes for it. Someone from another CSA told me, partly there are structural reasons for this that have nothing to do with what the people may want, but with how their businesses are conceived. If Cola has to gain 3,000 new members in 2 years because of its business plan, then they simply have to advertise more aggressively than what other CSAs have resources for. And obviously, this form of competition is, we know it from cooperatives in general, but it's relatively new among CSAs, or at least undocumented as far as I'm aware, simply because in most countries, CSAs have not reached the volume or the concentration to even encounter this challenge. So in terms of preliminary conclusions here, I would say that this case really shows potential new challenges for CSAs in terms of their autonomy, in terms of their scalability, because clearly, despite their non-capitalist nature, they are still vulnerable to market competition even with each other. And as a result, I think CSAs, as they grow and as they multiply, they may have to coordinate their business models and their practices with each other much more than previously thought. Or else they may have to rely more heavily on things like food hubs or dynamic procurement, like these infrastructures to actually help them extend their reach. And with that, I arrive at my conclusions, where I would say that, first of all, even though there has been this recent surge in CSA, I think it's unlikely to outgrow its economic niche quickly, especially when this new momentum subsides again. But as the UK network shows, collaboration is clearly very beneficial for CSAs in terms of scaling it up, scaling it out, scaling it deep, and certainly raises the practice beyond mere utopian entertainment, so to speak. And from an SSE perspective, collaboration really helps to advance both the economic and the political dimension of CSA. Especially here in the UK, where the context of the pandemic and Brexit have provided an opportunity to really quickly expand not just the material scope of CSA, but also its tactical range and its political nature. I think my research also shows that the priorities and the challenges of collaboration differ between scales. And to simplify it a bit, I think we can say that economic collaboration is preferable at smaller scales among neighboring CSAs, while political collaboration and advocacy are mainly reserved for the regional level and above. But clearly there's space for overlap here, depending on the available infrastructure and the available support. Now, the question whether CSA can be conducive for building what some authors call a broad class alliance, I think that's a different question. I think it's perhaps too ambitious to expect CSA to do that on its own, simply because the praxis obviously needs to some extent support by third-party organizations and policymakers to actually expand beyond the local scale. And I think ultimately CSA, it does not exist as an entirely autonomous practice in the first place. It is part of a wider movement for food system transformation. And it really draws on that movement's diversity of actors, of resources, of infrastructures to be able to flourish in that sense. And people engaged in that movement are very much aware of this, but it's something that our research, I think, still needs to catch up on, and where we need to find ways to sort of disentangle that complexity. And then finally, the transition to a more democratic and sustainable foundational economy obviously does not stop with the food system. And because of that, I'm still very interested to see how CSAs can perhaps collaborate beyond the agriculture and food sector and actually build more holistic alternative alliances. This is something that actually happens a lot in Italy, which is why I'm interested in this case still. But it's also something that is being pushed to some extent by members of the German CSA network, who are actually trying to expand community-supported business models to other sectors. That's still in its infancy, so there's not much to say about it yet. But obviously there's a lot of exciting opportunities for international exchange there, for instance. And I'm actually involved in planning some engagement events in this context. So hopefully before too long, I will have some things to share about this. Yeah, but until then, thanks a lot.
Many thanks, Bernd. You've covered a lot of ground in a little time there, and raised some really big issues from the sustainable food debates over recent years. You know, both socially, spatially, and politically. For example, on the social front, raising the thorny issue about the class composition of both production and consumption, and then spatially about the perils, if you will, of scaling up and scaling out, and what this means for the character of CSA movement. So lots of food for thought, no pun intended there. So time now for questions or comments from colleagues on the call. Who's going to kick us off here? I hope somebody's going to kick us off. Ian, thankfully, please.
Yeah, so many questions, Bernd. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was really clear, and yeah, I think it's a really exciting project and lots more to do. I guess I've got a number of questions, but I'll stick to one. I was quite interested in when you were talking about state or government support for things like food hubs or procurement. And I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts that with that kind of support, there may come conditions, and some of the conditions might be to take on some of these more competitive, commercialized relationships that you've seen in Germany.
Bernd, do you want to take that right away?
We can collect a few if you like.
Okay, let's move to Mike then. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I was wanting to ask you about, I suppose, the question of representation. And you mentioned that in Wales, the CSAs tend to be represented through the Land Workers Alliance. And you also then mentioned the conference and farmers and CSAs both making a point about distribution. And I suppose my question is about that, is that there's a much wider debate in Wales around agriculture and food. There are some similarities, but to what extent is there engagement between the CSAs and the wider farming community and the farming unions, or are they pulling in different directions? And how does that compare, for example, to what you've seen in other countries?
Bernd, will you try those first two questions, please?
Sure, I can do that. Yeah, so the question of whether support is conditional on let's say professionalization, maybe. I think that is a real concern. From what I understand, there are differences of opinion between CSAs to what extent they would actually want to engage in this sort of thing. I know especially procurement is sort of contentious because it requires them to sort of deliver amounts of food that they're not necessarily prepared to do. And in that sense, the national network, I believe, has actually decided not to encourage its members to engage in procurement because of that, they didn't encourage them not to do it, but they sort of did not encourage them to do it. So they sort of left it up to them to decide individually. It's a project that's not for every one of them because of those constraints that you mentioned. And yeah, in that sense, that's another difficulty that this diversity of business models brings with it, I think. And yeah, you can see, especially in Germany, a real difference between CSAs in terms of their size, which then creates major differences in terms of what their ambitions are, what they're actually trying to do. Like this large CSA co-op I talked about in Leipzig, they very much want to engage in competition with the commercial food system, and others do not want to do that. Others want to sort of stay autonomous, stay represent certain types of communities and want to become more socially accessible, but not in the way that this large professionalization entails. So there, I think the question is also, can they coexist with each other? Are they different enough that they attract different audiences, for instance? And I suppose the hope for a long time was that they would, but they're now increasingly realizing that there is overlap, and that is what creates competition. So this is a challenge they will have to face as they increase in numbers. To Mike's question, obviously different actors in the food system do pull into different directions. The Land Workers Alliance, I think, does not have much overlap with the National Farmers Union, and there are very different interests in terms of large-scale farmers, obviously, producing differently, producing under different standards, and not, being to some extent in competition with ecological agriculture, but just having different policy ambitions, different policy ideas. And the CSA movement, I think, is it's close to these small-scale ecological farmers. And in that sense, that is why it can, to some extent, be represented by the Land Workers Alliance. But there's a lot of complexity. There's some overlap with care farming as well, which is where the support by social farms and gardens comes in. It is a highly complex web of different actors, but very diverse. Very diverse interests there. You can't see it here, but Andrew actually sent me another question that I'd like to tackle about land access. I think the difficulty for CSAs to access land is one, because it becomes increasingly expensive, and the other because it's not actually sold off that much. Like there's very little mobility in that sense between in terms of actually having land being sold. So in that sense, it's difficult to get a hold of because of price and because of the need to react very quickly when there's land actually being offered. And obviously CSAs operate on a relatively small scale, so they often can't buy the amount of land that is being offered, which is why they require or often draw on the support by ecological land trusts, which are collective companies that buy up land very quickly, that sort of specialize on buying up land and holding it first of all, and then offering it specifically to small scale ecological producers. So in that sense, they do require that support. To some extent, they also, I think, get it from public holders, to some extent from church holders, but they do require this support, so to speak.
Thanks, Bernd. We have a couple of questions now. First from Julie. Julie, over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks so much, Bernd. I suspect the answer to my question is a no, but I wondered whether there's any data on the members of CSAs because I was interested in what was the point you were making, and I suspect that there isn't a lot of systematic data on who are members, to try to understand kind of, where they're coming from, and perhaps the overlap with other kinds of membership, i.e. are the people who are members of CSAs also members of other similar kinds of networks and movements. So it was kind of really a question about do the CSAs themselves have that data? Do they understand the members, or presumably because they're small and don't have a lot of kind of resource, they may not quite understand that?
I can respond right away. Yeah, the data is very patchy in that regard, and there are efforts by the networks themselves to generate that data. Like I said, they tend to circulate surveys to their members and hope to get answers to that, but it tends to be incomplete, and they don't necessarily publish those results. But yeah, from what I understand, it is a lot of young families. It tends to be people from middle-class backgrounds, especially people living in urban areas. And yeah, academic backgrounds, people who are, if not involved in other types of activism, then at the very least very much interested in environmental concerns. Yeah, so it's that sort of milieu that makes up much of the membership.
Now we've got a question from AMS 48.
It's Amy Sanders, Kevin. So hello, Bernd. I really enjoyed that. It was fascinating for me on a number of levels, mostly because I live quite close to Kaitan, so I'm very aware of it on a kind of personal level. And my question is fairly similar to Mike's, actually, where Mike was asking about the networks with the mainstream agricultural systems. I'm kind of interested in this, in these networks between other organizations that might have a similar ethos in terms of, the cooperative movement. And I have a background in the Wales cooperative movement. So it fascinated me when you were saying about the CSAs in the UK or Wales being particularly focused on agriculture and not really making links with that wider movement. And then when you mentioned in Germany that the CSAs are predominantly cooperatives, I wondered, well, is there a more established link with the rest of the cooperative movement in Germany because they're cooperatives, and because there's a leaning towards cooperatives? So I guess I'm fascinated by that. I'm surprised as well that the infrastructures like the Wales Cooperative Centre hasn't picked up in terms of supporting the CSA. So again, I'd love to hear more about why you think it is that they're limiting their networks within just the CSA's agricultural system and not looking at other wider movements.
I will have to clarify. It's not a majority of German CSAs that are cooperatives. It's specifically in Leipzig it is. But in general terms, it's not there, and it's still a minority, the CSA cooperatives. But they are, in Germany at least, more well organized, I guess. Even within the national network, the CSA cooperatives have their own working groups and sort of exist in a semi-autonomous fashion, have their own meetings, and really are pushing their cooperative agenda in that sense. And they're also, many of them at least, are much larger. The largest CSAs in Germany are pretty much all cooperatives of several thousand members. And they also happen to be the people, or at least people from those groups tend to be active in trying to expand CSA models beyond the food system. So I think to some extent it is down to individuals who are very active in that sense. To another extent, I think the cooperative movement also has a very strong tradition in Germany, or a very long tradition at the very least. I'm sure that's not wrong in the UK either, but I suppose there's, I don't know, they seem to really shape their own identity very much around this, much more than what I'm seeing in the UK, where I think the network really tries to highlight this diversity and this plurality, and doesn't really emphasize these internal differences between business models. At least that's the impression I'm getting. And I'm sure them and the Welsh Co-op Center, they probably know each other. I'm sure they cooperate on certain individual events. I think there are a lot of overlaps that we're just not aware of, just because they just happen incidentally, and it's not something that's always promoted. But there are also relatively few people active in this movement, which I think is another reason why they can't really be active on all of these fronts at once. Like I said, the first Welsh CSA network grew dormant because one person stopped being active. So a lot of it depends on individuals. It operates on that scale where that's definitely a concern.
Thanks, Bernd. Any other questions or comments? Ian, I think you said you had multiple questions. Do you want to go to question two?
Yeah, I started relaxing then, and you cut me out. But well, there were two that were in my head. There was this, this continuous issue in geography about what's rural and what's urban, and the extent to which these ideas are picked up in cities and more urban areas. And the other one was, I was thinking there's a kind of antagonism to what you called the dominant food system. And I was wondering whether you'd had some thoughts about how the dominant food system, however that's defined, responds to CSAs. Is it just through things like trying to package their existing products in a way that appeals more to people's utopian ideals, or are there more aggressive tactics towards CSAs within the dominant food system?
To your first question, I think this rural-urban divide, that's something CSAs are very aware of, I think, because when I ask them like how easy it is to establish CSAs in different areas, they said, 3 times easier to do it in or near a city. It's very much something they have to do where they tend to exist on the outskirts of larger cities, and there they can actually gain a lot of members. In fact, this new association that the CSAs around Leipzig founded, they gained funding in order to see whether they can extend food pickup stations across the rural hinterland. And they said they really can't. Like there's really not much demand, or not enough demand for that, because people living in rural areas, for the most part, either already grow their own food or personally know a farmer who does, so they don't necessarily have the same demand for CSA schemes. Apparently there may be more demand there for food hubs or for ecological stores or for things like that. So in that sense, they're very aware of that distinction. In terms of what we can call the dominant food system, I believe that the pandemic has really, from what I can tell from what other researchers have been doing, the pandemic has really pushed online food schemes, especially food box schemes and that sort of thing. And those are also just driven by traditional companies, and the scope, the scale and scope of that has expanded quite a bit during the pandemic. And I think if there are any concerns in that sense, where there may be some competition by traditional food producers, it's on that front, that there's that things like Uber Eats, things like Amazon may essentially create commercial food box schemes to an extent that creates this competition. I think there are a lot of concerns in that sense.
Bernd, can I, while people are waiting to ask a better question, can I suggest to you that one answer to Ian might be that the dominant food system is totally and utterly indifferent to the CSA, because it just doesn't register on its kind of corporate radar screen. And while in leftist green circles, critics are always maligning, quote, the dominant food system, can I suggest that the dominant food system is a good deal more agile than we care to admit? And whenever alternative products look like taking off, they are appropriated, albeit in an industrial kind of fashion. And that's been the history of the relationship between the conventional food system and all alternatives, including organics, of course. How would you react to that from a CSA point of view?
Yeah, I would very much agree with that. I mean, I don't think the specific CSA model as it works is something that makes too much sense for corporations to adopt. But yeah, certainly the ability to have food boxes, the ability to order food online, even like, yeah, ordering things in this way, and perhaps, yeah, putting an organic label on it, that's definitely something they are copying, and they have copied for a while now.
Mike's got his hand up. Over to you, Mike.
Yeah, I was just gonna, it's more a comment on some of these points rather than an extra question, but I entirely agree with what you just said there, Kevin, but I think it goes back to the question I asked you, Bernd, about the relationship with the wider farming community and unions. I think you know, Kevin's phrase, that wider agri-food system, including the traditional farmers and farming unions, are indifferent to these new approaches rather than opposed to it. And I think that's partly also the, picking up in Ian's point about the urban-rural difference. I think that's part of the challenge of CSAs going into rural areas, is the model of how CSAs are thought about doesn't necessarily translate because of the sense of population. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there are correspondences in interests and ways, you know, even some existing, you know, ways in which some farms move into the communities. And I think there is a gap there. And it does raise some questions about the geography of food production in Wales. And that sense of, you know, one of the big things we just said is that Wales needs to produce more, needs more horticulture, which is a key area that CSAs do. But that, you know, the space of growth that probably is in suburban, peri-urban areas, urban areas through CSAs, as opposed to transferring existing farmland outside. And there may be politics and tensions around that, which are interesting. But I was also, just going back to Amy's question, I was just briefly checking because I thought this was right. The Wales Cooperative Centre did produce a report on food and food production a couple of years ago, and there is that kind of interest there, and certain recommendations there being coming. So I think there are these correspondences, but I think probably from both sides it's not quite joining up. I don't know if that kind of is your experience of working with WellsBird. It's not necessarily that there's not linkages built, but it's sometimes these things. Well, I think there's one, maybe it is a point you raised, Ben, that actually people get involved in the CSA for the immediate benefits, not necessarily to build a wider movement.
Bernd?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, certainly participants are to a large extent consumers in that sense. They're not automatically activists, so to speak. And that's something that all CSAs are sort of aware of, and to an extent it's a challenge because it also raises questions to what extent they can include people in their activities. It raises questions to what extent they can actually retain people. It will raise questions, what happens after the pandemic? What happens when this momentum is over? Do people exit from CSAs again, or will they be able to retain the increased scope that they've developed? And those are all, yeah, very much legitimate concerns that I don't think anyone has an answer for yet.
I can't see any more hands up. It'll be interesting to see whether CSA prospects improve with all the new food initiatives coming out of Welsh Government, particularly the new food bill, where many people are hoping for a new, more consequential joined up food policy, because at the moment, Welsh Government is pursuing many food policies, but they're all fragmented and they're not integrated. Amy's got a final question. Thanks, Amy.
It's just a really quick one, actually. It's occurred to me when you were talking about food boxes to ask whether food boxes is the predominant way that CSAs manifest themselves. I'm aware that locally we had kind of shares in sheep, and people would own parts of some sheep within our local area. And I wondered if there's other systems besides food boxes that exist within CSA, or if it's dominated by food boxes.
Yeah, no, it's not even necessarily dominated by food boxes. I think many use food boxes just to make it easier and to gain more people, especially larger CSAs rely on them. But smaller ones don't even have that. They have central pickup stations or multiple pickup stations like for instance, they would have their farms in a peri-urban area and then have 1 or 2 pickup stations within the city. And that's where people would need to come to actually gather their food. So yeah, it's certainly not all or even most of them who deliver food boxes to people's homes. And yeah, things like a farm or like sheep shares, I've heard that as well. Those are interesting projects they have. Maybe also in response to what Kevin's been saying, another question about food policy and about the way that the policy system is being overhauled right now is also just the question of which farms even get support, because one major limitation in the UK has been that small-scale farms below 5 hectares were ineligible for direct payments and ineligible for pilot projects, and were basically completely ignored by policy. And that is something that completely hits CSA, because over 90% of CSAs are below 5%. So if they want to get support, that is something that needs to be tackled. And as far as I'm aware, policymakers are still not planning to change that. And that's, I think, in terms of shortcomings, that may be a major shortcoming.
A really good political point on which to end, Bernd. So on behalf of everyone, can I thank Bernd for a really excellent presentation. Thanks also to James Atkinson for being our technical guru behind the scenes, as it were. And thanks to everyone for making time to join us this afternoon for this WISERD seminar. Thanks to you all. Bye for now.
Thank you.